What situation divided your life into a before and after? I almost died on my motorcycle, and everything I knew about my life ended that day. But what happened next changed not just me, but hundreds of others. It all happened in the blink of an eye. One moment, I was riding my motorcycle through the golden sunset of my hometown, feeling unstoppable. The next, metal screamed, tires skidded, and my world exploded into fragments of pain and chaos. I remember thinking, this is it. This is how it ends. I wasn't afraid of dying. Not really. I was afraid of waking up and realizing I couldn't live the way I wanted. I wasn't just a biker. I was someone who loved life on the edge, someone who thrived on adrenaline and speed. And now, lying in a hospital bed with my leg twisted in ways it shouldn't, I realized that life had a cruel sense of irony. The one thing that made me feel alive had nearly ended it. Doctors told me I was lucky to survive. Lucky. That word echoed through my mind every time I tried to move my body and felt its betrayal. My right leg was shattered. My left arm wouldn't bend properly. I had cuts and burns that no mirror could ever fully hide. And the hardest part? The uncertainty. Will you ever walk normally again? They asked. I didn't know. The first nights in the hospital were the worst. Pain was constant, almost a living thing, gnawing at my nerves. Sleep didn't come easy, and when it did, nightmares came instead. Visions of my past life, of freedom and speed, slipping further and further away from me. I watched people walking past my window, their normal, mundane lives suddenly seeming impossibly distant. I couldn't imagine ever joining them again. But something strange happened in those silent, painful nights. Between the beeping monitors and distant footsteps of nurses, I started noticing small victories. My fingers could move slightly. I could flex my toes a little. Every tiny improvement felt monumental, a reminder that my body was still mine, still capable of fighting. And slowly, a thought formed. If I could survive this, maybe I could survive everything. Maybe I could rebuild. The first steps were terrifying. With a walker in front of me, trembling, I took 1, 2, 3 steps across the sterile hospital corridor. Each step screamed, "You can't do this. Stop. Go back to safety." But I didn't. I had to prove to myself that my life wasn't over. Not like this. Not like anyone else thought it should be. Physical therapy became my obsession. At first, it was humiliating. Watching others, younger and stronger, move effortlessly while I struggled with simple stretches was a blow to my pride. But pride was a luxury I couldn't afford. Every day, I pushed a little harder. Every day, I refused to accept limitations as final. And slowly, painfully, I began to reclaim my body. Friends and family watched with cautious hope. Some doubted, whispering that I should accept a slower pace, that some things just aren't meant to be. But doubt fueled me. Every whispered word of pity became a spark. I started writing down goals. Small ones at first. Touch my toes, climb stairs without assistance, jog for 1 minute. Then bigger ones, run 5 kilometers, ride a bike again, lift weights. Each goal achieved was proof. Life could be rewritten, even when the pages were stained with pain. The emotional journey was just as brutal as the physical one. I had to confront fear, frustration, and the despair that came with every setback. There were days I cried alone, nights I screamed into pillows, begging my body to cooperate. I had to learn patience in a world that had once glorified speed. I had to learn humility in a body that once felt invincible. And slowly, I started discovering a new kind of strength, one that wasn't measured by how fast I could go or how high I could jump, but by how stubbornly I refused to give up. By the time I left the hospital, I wasn't the same person who had arrived. My body was fragile, my scars visible and permanent. But my mind? My mind had transformed. I felt an unexpected gratitude for survival, for struggle, for the painful lessons that had stripped away arrogance and left me with something more valuable: resilience. I had learned that life doesn't just happen to you. You shape it, piece by piece, day by day, step by step. And in that moment, I made a promise. I wouldn't just rebuild for myself. I would rebuild to inspire others, to show that no matter how devastating the fall, no matter how broken you feel, the human spirit is capable of rising again. I didn't know how I would do it yet. I didn't know if it would be through training, through sharing my story, or through some other path. But one thing was certain: I couldn't waste the second chance I'd been given. Because life, I realized, is never about how you fall. It's about how you rise. Leaving the hospital felt surreal. The air outside seemed sharper, brighter, almost electric, as if the world had been waiting for me to return. But freedom came with a challenge I hadn't fully imagined. The hospital corridors had been a controlled battlefield. The outside world was unpredictable. Every uneven pavement, every flight of stairs, every doorframe became a test of endurance and patience. My first attempts at walking outside were humbling. With crutches supporting my broken leg, I moved cautiously, each step accompanied by a chorus of aches, throbs, and whispers of doubt in my mind. People passed by without a second glance, unaware of the small victories I was claiming with every faltering movement. I learned quickly that healing wasn't just physical. It demanded mental courage, a stubborn refusal to accept what seemed impossible. I started small, very small. 10 minutes of walking around the block, stretching every muscle I could remember existed. I fell several times. My knee screamed, my arm protested, and my pride felt shattered. But with each fall, I realized that getting back up was no longer optional. It was necessary. I started recording my progress, documenting the pain, the tiny wins, the setbacks. Seeing the improvement, no matter how incremental, became a fuel I hadn't anticipated. Physical therapy at home was a battlefield of its own. I filled my living room with resistance bands, dumbbells, and foam rollers. Early mornings became sacred, hours devoted to moving, stretching, strengthening. The first time I could lift my own body off the floor without assistance, I laughed until tears ran down my cheeks. It wasn't just a muscle movement, it was a declaration. I am still here. I'm not done. But progress was slow. I remember one particularly frustrating week where nothing seemed to improve. My leg refused to bend fully. My arm twitched uncontrollably with every attempt at lifting weight. The old, reckless biker in me wanted to rage, to quit, to scream at the unfairness of all. Yet somewhere deep, a voice whispered, "This is where change begins." I clung to that voice, turning anger into persistence. I discovered that recovery demanded creativity. I adapted exercises, improvised equipment, and learned to listen to my body in ways I had never needed before. I realized that every limitation was also an opportunity to push boundaries, to find new strength, to redefine what I thought I was capable of. I began setting goals that seemed impossible. First, 10 minutes of continuous walking without support, then jogging slowly on the treadmill, then lifting moderate weights. Each milestone was a victory, not just a muscle, but a mindset. The mental struggle was equally intense. Fear shadowed every attempt. Fear of falling, of breaking again, of never achieving what I once took for granted. There were nights I stayed awake, staring at the ceiling, imagining my old life, speeding down open roads, wind in my hair, and feeling it slip further away. But in that longing, I found motivation. I realized that my new path didn't have to erase the old one. It could honor it, transform it, and teach others that strength is not measured in speed, but in resilience. As my body slowly responded, I began exploring fitness communities online. I watched videos, read stories, absorbed techniques, and took notes obsessively. Each story of recovery became a spark. I began experimenting, body weight exercises, light resistance training, cardio adapted to my abilities. And something unexpected happened. I started seeing results. My muscles grew, my endurance increased, my confidence returned. The reflection in the mirror, once alien and scarred, began to resemble someone who could fight and win. The turning point came when I first ran without crutches. It wasn't fast. It wasn't graceful. My leg ached, my lungs burned, my arms shook. But I ran. Not for speed, not for show, just for the sheer triumph of proving to myself that I could. I laughed and cried at the same time, feeling a flood of emotions I couldn't contain. That single run marked a shift. I was no longer surviving. I was reclaiming my life. Motivation became a lifestyle. I woke up at dawn to train, pushing boundaries my body and mind once considered impossible. Each day, I documented progress, video clips, journal notes, small updates shared with friends who had doubted me. Slowly, a community of support emerged. Strangers who resonated with my story, people inspired to try despite their own fears, began reaching out. I realized that my journey had become bigger than myself. It was no longer just about healing. It was about showing that human resilience has no limits. And so, I committed fully to the path. From small victories in my living room to longer runs in the park, from tentative stretches to lifting heavier weights, I rebuilt. Not only my body, but my spirit. I began to understand that strength isn't instantaneous. It is painstaking, relentless, and often invisible. Every drop of sweat, every tear, every second of pain became a testament. If you refuse to give up, you can rise from even the darkest fall. Friends and family noticed the change, some in awe, others skeptical. But I didn't need validation. My own transformation was enough proof. I had begun inspiring not just myself, but others, even in small ways. Messages started coming. Your story gives me hope. I thought I couldn't, but seeing you makes me believe. Each message fueled my purpose. Each word a reminder that struggles could become stories of triumph, and scars could become symbols of strength. By the end of that year, I had achieved more than I thought possible. I could run, lift weights, climb stairs without support, and even ride a stationary bike with intensity. My body, once fragile and broken, had become strong again, but it was the mind that had transformed the most. I learned discipline, patience, resilience, and the power of turning setbacks into motivation. And as I looked at the reflection in the mirror, I realized that I had begun not just to reclaim my life, but to reshape it entirely into something meaningful, purposeful, and inspiring. The first time someone told me I inspired them, it hit me harder than any physical pain I'd ever felt. I was scrolling through a fitness forum, sharing a video of my modified workout routine, and I noticed a comment. "I can't walk without crutches yet, but seeing you run gives me hope." I paused, staring at the screen. For a moment, I didn't know how to respond. Hope? Me? Someone who only a year ago could barely move without assistance? It was humbling, yes, but also electrifying. Suddenly, my recovery wasn't just about me anymore. My journey could become a bridge for others, a living proof that determination can defy even the harshest setbacks. I began documenting everything more deliberately, video diaries, detailed step-by-step workouts, personal reflections. Each post carried a piece of my struggle and a piece of my triumph. My scars, once a source of shame, became badges of resilience. I realized that people didn't just want exercises, they wanted stories. They wanted to know the emotions behind every victory, the small, intimate battles that don't make it to social media highlight reels. So I shared them. The frustration of falling for the 5th time in one morning. The moment my leg finally bent without pain. The hours of repetitive stretching that no one would ever watch, but that were essential to progress. People responded. Messages poured in, some from accident survivors, others from people fighting illnesses, or simply struggling with motivation in daily life. Their stories intertwined with mine, and a community began to form, a network of people seeking strength in each other's journeys. At first, I was hesitant. Could I really help others? Was my experience enough to make a difference? But then I remembered the nights I'd stared at the ceiling, wondering if I'd ever walk again. If one word, one video, one piece of advice could prevent even one person from feeling that despair, wasn't it worth it? I started hosting live sessions, teaching adaptive workouts, sharing mental strategies, and answering questions. Each session revealed a raw truth. People were hungry for guidance, but they were hungrier for authenticity. They didn't need a flawless athlete. They needed someone who had fallen, struggled, and risen again. Soon, I began collaborating with local gyms and rehabilitation centers. They invited me to speak to accident survivors, people recovering from surgeries, and those struggling to regain confidence in their bodies. Standing in front of them for the first time, I felt the weight of responsibility. My voice shook initially, but I shared my story as I had lived it, unfiltered, emotional, real. I spoke about fear, pain, doubt, and ultimately hope. When a young man with a recent spinal injury approached me afterward, tears in his eyes, saying, I thought I'd never walk again. Now I think maybe I can. I realized that inspiration wasn't just a feeling. It was action, a ripple effect that could change lives. I also started experimenting with online platforms. Short videos, motivational posts, interactive Q&A sessions. I shared my workouts adapted for various levels of ability, from wheelchair users to those with limited mobility. I emphasized that progress wasn't linear, that setbacks weren't failures, and that the body's limitations didn't define the mind's potential. The online response was overwhelming. People from around the world began sharing their stories of improvement, sending me videos of their own training journeys, asking for advice, and expressing gratitude. Every message was a reminder. I had turned personal struggle into collective inspiration. But it wasn't easy. Running a growing online presence while continuing my own recovery tested my limits. There were days I felt drained, frustrated, even doubting if I could maintain consistency. Yet, each time I considered pausing, I remembered the messages, the faces, the gratitude. The collective hope of people counting on me became a force stronger than fatigue or self-doubt. Slowly, I realized that helping others fueled my own growth. Sharing struggles and victories didn't diminish my journey. It amplified it. With each success story I witnessed, I felt an unparalleled sense of purpose. A woman who had suffered a serious fall started exercising daily, documenting her progress inspired by my story. A teenager recovering from a car accident told me she had begun swimming again after months of fear. Even strangers battling anxiety, not physical injuries, found motivation in the way I tackled challenges. My journey had become a template, a living proof that adversity could be a teacher and recovery could be a beacon for others. I began incorporating mental training into my advice. Physical recovery was vital, but I learned that true resilience came from mindset. Meditation, visualization, journaling, tools I had used to manage fear and frustration, became integral parts of my guidance. I shared practical exercises to build patience, mental strength, and discipline. The feedback was immediate. People reported better adherence to routines, more confidence, and reduced anxiety. My approach was no longer about just physical exercise. It was holistic, touching body, mind, and spirit. The community grew beyond online platforms. Local workshops, motivational talks at schools, and rehabilitation centers became regular events. Every session, I reminded myself that I wasn't just an instructor, I was a living testament. My scars, my crutches, my struggles, they were the most compelling tools I had. People listened because I had lived the pain, not because I was preaching theory. And in their eyes, I saw reflection, empathy, and sometimes a spark of hope that mirrored the spark I had found in myself months ago. Through all of this, I discovered an unexpected truth. Inspiration is reciprocal. The people I encouraged, the messages I received, the shared victories, they strengthened me in ways nothing else could. Every story I heard was a reminder that resilience is contagious. One small act, one shared experience, could ignite a chain reaction, transforming despair into determination, weakness into strength, and fear into hope. By the end of that year, my mission had evolved. It was no longer simply about my own recovery. It was about building a movement, a community where obstacles became opportunities and where every individual could find courage through another story. I had started as a man broken by an accident, unsure if he could even stand. Now, I was standing, not just physically, but in purpose, in spirit, and in influence. I had begun turning pain into power, not just for myself, but for countless others who were ready to rise, just as I had. Becoming an inspiration was one thing. Learning to sustain it, to turn into a real force that could impact lives consistently, was another. I quickly discovered that influence carried weight, sometimes heavier than I anticipated. When people began seeing me as a symbol of resilience, they projected expectations onto me. They wanted perfection, immediate answers, and unwavering motivation, and, at times, I felt the pressure crushing. The very scars and struggles that had made me relatable suddenly became standards I felt I had to uphold. My first real test came during a rehabilitation workshop I organized at a local center. I had gathered survivors of accidents, people recovering from surgeries, and even those with chronic illnesses. My plan was to demonstrate adaptive workouts and lead a session that balanced physical exercise with mental coaching. But the moment I stepped in front of the group, my own doubts surged. I noticed a young woman in a wheelchair, her eyes fixed on me with skepticism. A man with a prosthetic leg shifted impatiently, clearly frustrated. They had been through hardships far greater than mine, and for the first time, I questioned whether my story, my progress, could truly matter to them. I started with my usual introduction, recounting my accident, my fall, and my journey back. But as I spoke, I sensed the tension in the room, the unspoken question hovering over everyone. Can he really understand what I'm going through? I paused. Then, instead of glossing over my struggles, I shared the most painful moments, the nights of despair, the overwhelming fear of never regaining independence, the countless days I cried out in frustration while stretching my injured leg. I described the small victories no one sees. The first time I stood without support, the first steps on my own, the tiny adjustments that eventually led to running. Something shifted. The woman in the wheelchair leaned forward, tears brimming. The man with the prosthetic nodded slowly, a subtle sign of acknowledgement. I realized that authenticity, vulnerability, and humility were far more powerful than perfection. My role wasn't to be a flawless symbol, but a mirror reflecting their own potential, a living proof that struggle could coexist with hope. That moment marked a turning point, not only for them, but for me. I understood that real leadership required embracing imperfection, sharing fear as much as triumph, and guiding others through their own uncertainties rather than presenting a polished, untouchable persona. Yet challenges continued to mount. Running workshops, managing online platforms, and maintaining my personal fitness regime was exhausting. There were days I questioned my energy, my effectiveness, even my purpose. I remember one evening, scrolling through messages from people seeking advice, encouragement, and guidance, feeling utterly depleted. Each message was a plea for hope, and every day I had to summon the energy to meet that demand. Burnout was looming, but I had no choice. I owed it to those counting on me. I had discovered a truth often overlooked. Leadership isn't about charisma or talent alone. It's about consistency, resilience, and self-discipline. It's about showing up, even when every fiber of your body and mind is screaming to stop. The trials weren't only emotional. They were logistical and societal as well. As my influence grew, so did criticism. Some questioned my qualifications, others doubted my methods. "You're not a licensed trainer," one comment read. "You survived an accident. That doesn't make you a fitness expert." At first, I bristled. I wanted to defend myself, to prove my worth. But then I realized something crucial. Skepticism and criticism were inevitable, part of the very ecosystem of influence. I couldn't control perceptions, only my actions. I focused on results, feedback from those whose lives I genuinely impacted, and the tangible improvements I could foster. My work was validated not by strangers' opinions, but by the change I could ignite in those who trusted me. I also faced ethical dilemmas. Some followers wanted to push themselves beyond safe limits, attempting exercises that could harm them. Others misunderstood my guidance, expecting miracles overnight. I had to balance encouragement with caution, pushing motivation without risking injury. Every decision carried weight. Every recommendation could help or hurt someone. I became hyper-aware of responsibility. Real influence demanded not just inspiration, but integrity, knowledge, and accountability. Financial challenges added another layer. Organizing events, maintaining equipment, and investing in professional training for myself required resources. For a time, I relied on donations, small online earnings, and sponsorships. But as I expanded my reach, I realized I needed a sustainable model. Monetizing my workshops and online programs wasn't about profit. It was about creating infrastructure that could support growth, fund scholarships for accident survivors, and provide resources to people who otherwise couldn't afford professional guidance. Learning to navigate this aspect of leadership, money, logistics, outreach, was as daunting as any physical rehabilitation I had undergone. Amid these pressures, I discovered the power of collaboration. I began partnering with physiotherapists, psychologists, and fitness coaches. Together, We developed comprehensive programs that addressed not only physical recovery, but mental well-being and lifestyle changes. This team approach multiplied the impact, allowing me to focus on motivation and inspiration while experts handled specialized guidance. Collaboration became a cornerstone of my philosophy. No one, not even someone who had overcome a life-altering accident, could achieve true impact alone. Yet the most profound trial was personal, the constant struggle to maintain authenticity. As my following grew, I felt the temptation to craft a persona that was endlessly confident, endlessly resilient. Social media amplifies perfection, and I feared my story might be consumed as spectacle rather than lived truth. Each time I caught myself curating rather than sharing, I paused, reminded of the moment I first realized the power of vulnerability. Authenticity was my lifeline, my moral compass, and the true engine of influence. Without it, my story would become hollow. In the midst of all this, a turning point emerged, a community initiative that allowed me to merge purpose with action. I organized a week-long fitness and recovery camp for accident survivors and individuals facing mobility challenges. The camp wasn't just about workouts. It was about connection, mutual support, and learning from each other. Every participant shared personal stories, demonstrated their own strategies for resilience, and encouraged peers. Watching strangers bond over shared struggles, witnessing laughter after tears, seeing hope ignite in exhausted eyes, I realized my journey had transcended personal achievement. I had become part of a larger movement, a living network of empowerment. By the end of that year, I had grown in ways I never anticipated. I was stronger, not just physically, but mentally and emotionally. I had learned to navigate criticism, logistical hurdles, and the weight of responsibility. I had discovered the power of collaboration, the necessity of authenticity, and the irreplaceable value of empathy. My influence had evolved from personal story to actionable guidance, from inspiration to leadership. And yet, despite the progress, I understood that the journey was far from over. By the time I reached the 5th year after my accident, the rhythm of my life had transformed completely. What once had been small, painstaking steps of physical recovery had grown into strides of influence, motivation, and leadership. I now stood at a threshold where my story was no longer solely about me. It was about the countless lives I had touched and the broader movement I was helping to ignite. Yet, even as I celebrated these milestones, I understood that the journey was not defined by accolades or followers, but by the tangible difference one could make in another person's life. The first moment that crystallized this realization came unexpectedly. I received an email from a young man, barely 18, who had suffered a spinal injury in a car accident. He wrote with raw honesty about his despair, describing nights spent immobilized, consumed by self-doubt, and fearful of even attempting to regain independence. He told me he had watched every video I posted, read every story, and practiced every routine I suggested. But more importantly, he shared that he had begun walking again, not perfectly, not without effort, but with determination. "You made me believe in myself," he wrote. "Even when I couldn't, I saw you, and it made me try." Reading those words, I felt a deep, almost indescribable connection, a recognition that the seeds of hope planted through my vulnerability and consistency had sprouted in someone else's life. I realized then that true impact isn't measured in likes, followers, or temporary admiration. It is measured in the courage inspired, the resilience nurtured, and the choices empowered. That email became a beacon, a reminder that every ounce of effort, every shared struggle, and every moment of honesty mattered. From that point, my focus shifted from merely inspiring to creating sustainable structures that amplified resilience and wellness. I began developing mentorship programs, pairing survivors of accidents and injuries with volunteers who had successfully navigated similar paths. These mentorship relationships were powerful. They offered guidance, encouragement, and real-life examples that textbooks or videos could never replicate. I watched participants, initially unsure of their potential, transform into mentors themselves, guiding others and perpetuating a cycle of empowerment. The movement became self-sustaining, growing organically through shared experience and communal strength. Social media, once a platform for personal storytelling, evolved into a hub for resources, community, and motivation. I collaborated with medical professionals, nutritionists, and fitness experts to produce content that was accessible, safe, and evidence-based. We hosted live Q&A sessions, virtual training programs, and interactive workshops. The online community swelled, but beyond numbers, what mattered were the stories. The man who regained partial mobility in his legs, the woman who overcame chronic pain to start running again, the teenager who reclaimed confidence after a traumatic sports injury. Each story reinforced the collective message. Setbacks are not the end. Recovery, adaptation, and growth are possible for anyone willing to try. Yet, even with growth and recognition, challenges persisted. Some days were harder than others. The weight of responsibility, the constant demand for guidance, and the personal sacrifices required could feel overwhelming. But I had learned to manage these pressures through balance, self-care, and the unwavering knowledge that my work was part of something larger than myself. I adopted routines that nurtured both physical fitness and mental resilience, remembering that leading by example required demonstrating sustainability and balance in my own life. The pinnacle of this journey came during an annual event I organized, a 3-day resilience summit for survivors, mentors, and advocates. Over 3 days, hundreds of participants gathered, sharing personal victories, attending workshops, and building connections that would extend far beyond the event. On the final day, during the closing ceremony, a montage of stories flashed across the screen. Faces of people who had walked, run, and lifted themselves from despair, each frame a testament to the human spirit and the collective effort of our community. I stood on stage, reflecting on how far we had come, not just physically, but emotionally and socially. And for the first time, I felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude, humility, and accomplishment, knowing that the ripples of one accident, one struggle, and one person's determination could spread into a movement that empowered hundreds, maybe thousands. It was in that moment that I understood the essence of my journey. Inspiration is fleeting, but transformation is enduring. My accident had taken away certain physical abilities, but it had gifted me insight, empathy, and the capacity to catalyze change. The pain I endured became a bridge connecting me to others, and my story, shared openly and honestly, became a tool for empowerment. Every tear, every failure, every painstaking step had been part of a larger design, a testament that human resilience is limitless when nurtured with courage, community, and persistence. Today, I continue to train, to lead, and to inspire. I travel, speak, and mentor, but the core of my mission remains unchanged: to transform pain into purpose, struggle into strength, and setbacks into opportunities for growth. I see people reclaiming their lives, achieving milestones they once thought impossible, and, in turn, inspiring others. The cycle of resilience perpetuates itself, expanding beyond borders, age, and circumstance. And in every story, every smile, every stride taken after a fall, I see proof that life can be rebuilt, reshaped, and reimagined. Looking back, it is clear the motorcycle accident that once seemed like an ending was, in truth, the beginning of a much greater story. A story not just of survival, but of empowerment, influence, and lasting legacy. The journey from the hospital bed to leading a movement taught me that true strength is measured not by how we stand alone, but by how we lift others. And as long as there are people ready to rise after a fall, my mission continues, because resilience, once shared, becomes unstoppable. In the end, this is more than a story about me. It is a story about every person who refuses to give up, every individual who fights to reclaim life after hardship, and every soul inspired to become the catalyst of their own transformation. And that is a story worth sharing over and over again, because the power of human potential, once ignited, can never be extinguished.